Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly.
Broadcast from later, we are talking about weak signals. That just means things we sense that we suspect may have a significant influence on the futures, but we don't know anything. I'm Robert Bolton in Toronto, joined today by Valdez Sillins and Eric White, Radha, Mistry, friend of the show in LA. Tobias Revell is here, streaming from London. Tobias is an artist and designer and critical engager, as well as a cyclist and a gamer, and he will be the Design Futures lead at Air Up soon, in about a month. How are you, Tobias?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Thanks for being here. Tobias is affiliated with far too many cool projects and studios and research groups to mention right now, but I will instead ask you, what's your weakest signal?
Canon, about 2 weeks ago, decided to remove chips from print cartridges, citing the chip shortage. And I don't think the global chip shortage is a weak signal. It's a very strong signal that everybody knows about. But what's really interesting is that manufacturers are now having to make a decision about the direction of their innovations based on the previous assumption that there would be chips to go in everything all the time forever into the future. And so the fact that Canon has obviously internally made a calculus, which is the potential cost of people selling cheap knockoff ink cartridges and us losing money on them is less than the cost of the escalating price of silicon, basically. And that also includes a future-facing calculation, because one of the major components of the manufacture of silicon is enormous amounts of coking coal, which comes almost exclusively from China. Silicon has to be superheated to like 1500 degrees, like 3 times in the process. And it's a process that's about 100 years old and hasn't really been updated in all that time. So at the same time, there's sort of an unofficial trade war going on with China, where most of the world's coking coal comes from, as well as environmental pushback on destructive manufacturing processes, as well as a global supply chain crisis, which means there's a chip shortage. Companies are starting to sort of say, okay, we're going to have to start taking chips out of things. So where 5 or 10 years ago, it was put a chip in everything, connected to the internet, monitor it, track it. It's now, okay, we need to actually decide where those chips go, which is really, really interesting and implies a sort of turn. So in my mind, also, there's a connection here all the way through to the resurgence of right-wing extremism in the 2024 elections in the US via the escalating costs of GPUs and the collapse of crypto and the sort of anti-institutional tendencies of people engaged in crypto. So it's that, to me, although the global chip shortage is a well-known thing, is a really interesting instantiation of the chip shortage in a very real way, which indicates a sort of change in direction for relatively mediocre practices and companies.
Well said. Thank you for that. And so it's a lot in there. You had said that there was a conspiratorial sort of thing, and I was a sense where that was kind of going. Do you want to elaborate on that part? Is that's sort of the last part you were getting at there, or?
Well, yes, that was sort of the last part I'm getting at, because obviously the major hardware of 2019 onwards has been the GPU, right? The graphics processing unit. And a lot of the predictions about the future of various technologies are predicated on the availability of GPUs, whether that is the metaverse and immersive virtual environments, which require heavy GPUs and heavy lifting to do, increasingly in cloud computing, so GPUs in a server center somewhere streaming to you. See that in like Google Strada as a first version of that, where gaming is done over streaming rather than on a console or on a desktop PC. Or it's GPUs involved in crypto and crypto mining in particular, and the minting of various tokens and stuff that are imagined for that particular version of Web3. So whether it's the crypto version or the meta version, both of them rely heavily on GPUs, which have been escalating in price ever since the sort of Bitcoin explosion of 2013-ish, and the increasing amount of people interested in gaming and virtual environments and things like that. If you couple this then with the increasing price of silicon, specifically as a material, for all the reasons I mentioned before, the supply chain as well as the manufacturing costs, that sort of future ideology and those softwares that would be based on that hardware seem increasingly unlikely because of the escalating cost of the GPU. Another parallel to that is artificial intelligence, of course, which also relies incredibly heavily on GPUs, because the current instantiation of artificial intelligence is based on machine learning, which happens using GPUs. One of the really interesting discussions now happening in artificial intelligence circles, even amongst like Google X, is that the dependence of artificial intelligence research on GPUs may be really problematic. And it may be that we've sort of gone down an alleyway of research which might fundamentally be flawed because we won't be able to use the hardware for much longer, or it won't be accessible for much longer. So basically, that Canon thing, I was like, it's actually becoming a real thing that people are starting to roll back on how they're using silicon and where they're using it.
Yeah. What's the projections look like, or do you have an opinion on how long the chip shortage is likely to last? Yeah. What's the scenario there?
I mean, it depends who you listen to. If you listen to the political podcasts, like Talking Politics or whatever, they would say that's just where we are now. We've sort of hit the nadir of our availability of silicon, and it's only going to go. We're
running out of sand.
Well, sand is another factor. The other factor is steel, which is a major component. The current European or American has about 15 tons of steel in their life. There's an upper limit on the amount of steel we can manufacture for the same reasons. In the so-called developing world, it's about 3 to 8 tons of steel per person. And if those places are to develop in the way that the governments would like them to develop in a lot of those places, then they will require that amount of steel, which is also a very similar process to the manufacturing of silicon. It requires a lot of cooked coal, which is running out and is only really coming from China. So there is a sense that we're really at the nadir of it, and that it may be downhill from here, unless there are massive advances in recycling technology. At the moment, recycling silicon and computational components is incredibly costly and difficult. And again, mostly happens in China, which is obviously under all these trade embargoes and trade wars from the US particularly.
Interesting. You pointed to the implication of the choices that will have to be made around product development and innovation. And what are the other things like inkjet cartridges that chips can be removed from? And what the function of them? What was the function of them?
The function of chips and ink cartridges was around DRM. So basically, it was to stop third parties manufacturing ink cartridges for printers, so that you had to buy more expensive manufacturer ones. That was the point of it. So, like I said, they've obviously made a calculus, which is we'd rather lose the money to sort of cheap third-party print cartridges than spend it on putting a little chip inside a print cartridge that speaks to the printer. The other interesting thing about that particular decision was they'd had to release instructions on how to circumvent the DRM on printers. So Canon had to publish to their users, this is how you get around the digital rights management software we built into our devices in order to use them, which is really interesting.
It's a noble move of them.
It's an interesting move, isn't it? And also, I was talking to a friend the other day who was wondering how much this ties into, in Europe, there's been a load of laws passed about right to repair that sort of came in at the end of last year, which are probably leading the way on the rest of the world, and that will shortly come, which basically means all manufacturers have to make it possible for a third party to repair their hardware, which up until now they haven't had to, right? And we know that particularly with companies like Apple, they've been particularly hardcore on not allowing other people to access their hardware. So it may be that those things are also tied together, where Canon are like, well, you know what? People are going to be able to open these things up anyway under these new laws. We might as well just roll back the control we had. Yeah. Also, I mean, who's really buying inkjet printers anymore? Like, how many are there in the world? Are they still a thing?
I think some people may, but I certainly don't. I know. I mean, you mentioned obviously these very hype emerging technologies that are going to rely on GPUs. Do we think it's realistic that anything slows down in the development of those, or is it something that's going to a way will be found and pushed through?
Well, the GPU is a somewhat incidental piece of technology. It was something that was developed around the University of Utah in the 1950s as a way of sending pixels to a screen. And then it just ended up being very good at that, and it turned out good at a bunch of other applications. There is an increasing clamor from particularly the artificial intelligence world that says that it's not necessarily the only bit of hardware, not necessarily even the best bit of hardware. I'm already seeing, I think the investment in quantum computing went up last year, something like 1,100%, huge leaps in quantum computing investment, which would obviously, everything we know about binary computing would go out the window if that became feasible for the world's leading tech companies. And so all that hardware would be completely redundant at that point anyway, as would the whole crypto culture, because suddenly encryption is useless as well. So
one solution would be a new paradigm of computing, which would be quantum. We've written scenarios about bioprocessing units and the idea that there could be some other more organic material that would allow computing. And
I mean, the much more feasible scenario, I imagine, would just be a sort of rollback of what was once called the Internet of Things. So this idea about manufacturers putting a chip in everything and connecting to everything else.
They stopped putting a chip in everyone when we get the vaccine. We'll save them plenty. Right? That's where I thought you were going to go with this conspiracy theory thing. For the folks at home, I'm joking.
I mean, the conspiratorial route I was going down was I read a piece, and I think it was in Mother Jones. It was called Who Buys Crypto? And it was saying that the tendency of the people involved in the crypto world are generally white men who would have libertarian anti-institutional tendencies. And given either a collapse in crypto as a market and just them all losing their money, or regulation from government, they would probably end up becoming quite fervently right-wing and voting quite fervently right-wing and being quite vocally right-wing in a way that they're just not really that engaged with sort of politics at the moment. So there is a chain of reasoning that says chip shortage through to resurgent massive.
Okay. Seems to be happening regardless. Anybody else want to chime in on the chip shortage? You've blown everyone's mind.
The only thing I would add is that like another thing that's happening is companies are turning to designing chips for specific hardware. So like the Apple M1 is like designed specifically for that laptop, and that had never happened before. So these kind of like computing companies are bringing chip creation internally. Moore's law was like already declining before the supply problem started occurring in the last year last year. I don't know how long it's like since the crypto boom. No, is that like not the main cause of the?
Well, the main cause was the shutting of manufacturing in East Asia, basically for COVID. So when, a bit like with steel as well, most of it is manufactured in China, and when the factories were just outright closed, it ended up with a backlog. It's been increasing demand at the same time. So. Right.
If it's mainly the manufacturing thing, we're likely to get back on track with production of chips. But yeah, as you said, there's all these other factors.
Yeah, I mean, the other factor is the environmental cost of it, and it's just unfeasible for us to meet the needs we have as a human race while manufacturing the amount of silicon we do, because it is, like I say, it's a 150-year-old process that remains largely unchanged.
Yeah.
And it's deeply inefficient.
I mean, the Internet of Things never lived up to what it was supposed to either. And I'm like, everything does not need to have a chip in it. Maybe that was never a good idea anyway.
I was just going to say, though, I wonder what this means for industries who already felt like investing in the Internet of Things was a lot for them. So, for example, like, what does this mean for industries like construction, where they're already dealing with very, very low profit margins? And so whatever they are investing in innovation, it's a big deal for them, right? Like anything that they're investing in that space is going to be very significant. And so if we have a chip shortage, does that mean that our dream of like connected environments that sense and provide data back to the user and shift and mold to occupants and like all of that, like the architect's dream of what the future might look like, where does that go?
There was this point where chips were getting smaller and smaller, like Valda said, like entering into like certain companies were starting to bring that inside or like internally. And then you have this like energy use and like between crypto or whatever, and then prices starting to rise. But I'm wondering how crucial silicon is to chip production, and then what that means for other industries that are reliant on silicon, what that also means for like just, I guess, craft chip making. I'm just trying to think of like, what are the alternative designs to chips? And then does that mean that like older GPUs will be retrofitted or something? Or what are the other like weird little craft moments of like chip production that are happening outside of maybe like mass production of chip making?
Is the silicon that's used in chips the same silicon that's used in like prosthetics and implants and things like that? Or is that different?
I don't know. And I also was wondering as you were talking, Radha, about how it ties into the general sand shortage, right? Because that's another major aspect, is that, and that deeply affects the construction industry, is that the world is running out of sand, particularly used in the manufacturing of concrete, which is for concrete, I know it has to be a particular type of fine sand. It can't be beach sand, it has to be like really fine sand. Is really hard to come by. So I don't know, before that point in the chain where you're manufacturing silicon for mass production of chips, where the material flows are and what particularly is going where. I know that with regards to whether GPUs are changing, people are looking back at other forms of computation, and the idea of sort of modular chip systems that connect together is being revisited as being really wasteful, and whether it's much more single and concentrated. I can't remember. There was a computer built recently called like the Viking or something that was based on a 60s design, but like massively overpowered, and it turned out to be much better at doing AI doing so-called AI than stacked GPUs. But I think that's all sort of theoretical at the moment, because most of that research is in the commercial zone, really, and not in sort of academic places where they're able to do that kind of experimentation. So it's just companies buying up loads of NVIDIA GPUs and stacking them up as quickly as possible. And going back to Radha's point about the Internet of Things, I think that was the major thing from the Canon chip point, was like they're just going, this idea of just putting a chip in everything is sort of not going to work out. We don't have the capital to do that anymore. So we can't put a chip in our toothbrush or in our washing machine or whatever it is to connect it to the internet. So maybe that sort of, there's just a sort of dial back, I think, of that aspiration to maybe more necessary applications.
There's a dial back, but there's, like you were saying, with like the repair bit and like people even salvaging, there is like this collection of chips happening outside of just the mass production of chip making as well.
You got to wonder if it gets to the point where it's like copper at the moment. The recycling of chip, there's no real mechanized process. You have to sort of do it by hand and unstitch it all and unsolder everything and pull everything out, which is why it's not widely done. But does it get to a point where that becomes worth it? And then do you end up with, similar to copper, where you end up with a black market of people just stripping silicon out of random, the sort of connected lamppost outside of my house has the silicon chip removed from it one night because the silicon's worth so much to trade, right? At that point. Wow. That already sort of exists in sand in I can't remember, it's like in Singapore in particular, where there's sort of a real, massive building project and there's sort of quasi-legal grey area sand trading going on, around Vietnam as well, where the beaches apparently are suitable. You can see that sort of creeping up the chain a bit to silicon possibly.
To sort of take like a little bit of inventory, we've talked about a lot of the sort of possible implications here. Like one is the e-waste recycling thing that at scale is right now super expensive, as I understand, partly because there's so much shipping that has to be involved in actually doing that. But though as I understand it, there's also been quite a bit of progress. Like it was almost non-existent 10 years ago, right? In e-waste recycling. So there's the what do we prioritize? Which I think for a lot of people, looking at things like crypto, it's been cool technology. Is this the project we need to be pursuing at all costs, given some of the environmental consequences and so on? And this question of, do we really need to put a chip in everything, IoT side of things? I like what Erica was bringing up though too. Are there not alternatives to silicon or alternative pathways to producing silicon? And I don't know enough about the sort of material science of that to say. Yeah,
I feel like if there was, we would know more about it. Maybe there is, and maybe especially when you look at quantum computing, which maybe you've looked at a bit more, maybe it's different hardware standards.
It is a cyclical process in capitalist technological development, that whenever there's a shortage, that incentivizes people to go find other means. And so there are ways that the peak oil discussion in the 70s, I do think peak oil actually exists. It's just there's a finite amount of oil. Of course there is, right? But our access to it was the thing that changed, and so they discovered in the 70s new offshore supplies and built oil rigs that nobody ever thought would have been possible to drill under the ocean, or fracking as well, which was developed another way to get more oil. So there are ways that, or even finding alternatives to whatever it was that you used to do through oil. In this case, what you used to do through a chip. I think that's kind of cool. It's could it incentivize plant sensing, or other forms of really basic sensing technology that doesn't need a silicon-based computation device within it? I think that's kind of interesting. I don't know where it would go, but
in terms of the problems that are solved through devices that use chips, there are definitely other ways, and potentially more efficient or more sustainable, or ones that don't require resources that are depleted in the same way. So
I spend a lot of my time reading political opinion and political podcasts and stuff, and the role of this shortage is sort of emblematic of in the same way maybe oil dominated the politics of the 70s and beyond through peak oil and sort of colonial projects in the Middle East to try and deal with that crisis. This could quite likely have the same implications. And it's not just about the silicon, it's about the manufacturing, it's about the coking coal required, it's everything. You could end up with this being a sort of real sea change and becoming a real sort of shibboleth in global politics, as people sort of scramble for silicon in the same way as they did once for oil, especially if it's so the manufacturing and distribution is so concentrated in one part of the world as it is.
One thing about this is regardless of what it actually means, it brings up some interesting questions just about our priorities and the technological projects that we're pursuing. I'm wondering, Tobias, as a gamer, do you feel hey, these are GPUs and these are for graphics and not for all this other stuff? We need to prioritize gaming and graphics usage of them and find something else for these other.
I think it goes even broader than that. When I was saying it's a nadir, I think it genuinely a nadir of futurism in a way as well, because the narrative of futures that come from particularly the stack, so Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, etc., is the next gadget, right? So Frederick Jameson said that we're living in the predetermined past of an inevitable future, right? It's Apple today, Facebook today rather, or maybe it was yesterday, accidentally leaked a bunch of patents for future headsets they'll have for their metaverse, right? All of which are dependent on silicon. And so the next gizmo, the next gadget, the next platform, the next service becomes the determinate future of the past we're already in. And when you get to a point where that's just not believable because of the everyday life that we experience, where maybe we can't access new gadgets and gizmos super easily in the way that we in sort of some parts of the world currently can, that narrative belief in being able to sell the next device or the next object or the next gizmo starts to fall apart, right, in a really interesting way, because the fundamentals of it don't work anymore. That becomes a real challenge for when, you know, if you are, let's say, a massive social networking company built by a guy who wanted to rate the attractiveness of women at his university. If you, for instance, you did that and you constantly sell the future based on your next step while dodging the repercussions of your current product, and suddenly you can't do that because you can't deliver anymore on them, then that becomes a real issue. For every success story there is in technology, there are, as we all know, 919,999 failures that just aren't very well documented. So it could quickly become the norm that actually more things break than succeed. And we do develop an expectation that our products and devices and gadgets and gizmos last longer because they are harder to replace and are more expensive. Amazon made I can't remember what the exact number is, but Amazon was making like an 80% loss on each Alexa it sold because it just wanted to get it into your home, but the hardware cost was much more than it was selling it for. You know, as it was, that was sort of sustainable, but that doesn't mean it always will be.
That's a fact. Yeah. Also, I think all of the interesting sort of features, researchers and people working on design fiction are creating these alternatives to this like big tech deterministic vision of like the next gadget. So the fact that that's being explored so widely by those that don't have sort of a horse and a gadget in the race or whatever.
In design, right, there's been a pushback against sort of techno-solutionism for the last 10 years. So this idea that it's just about getting the right gadget. This idea that actually is more about addressing systemic issues and looking at long-term change that can be owned and operated by the people you're trying to help. That kind of stuff is there and already acknowledged. And at the moment, a lot of the major tech firms kind of pay a service to it, but to actually have to do it because that's the only way they're going to be able to make a meaningful impact through there. And I mean meaningful and profitable impact, because they won't be able to constantly release new gadgets because it becomes increasingly undesirable and expensive to do so. So I wonder if in 15 years we look back on Canon removing DRM chips from ink cartridges and go, that was the moment that people stopped making stuff to fix problems.
Back to that parallel to oil in the 70s, there were all these visions in the 70s, like the whole Earth catalog was part of this kind of like, okay, OPEC moment of like, okay, oil is no longer going to be cheap. What do? We have to decentralize, learn how to live off the land, like small scale, super high quality technologies that like enable us to thrive, like without these, super cheap sources of input. And then in the 80s, it all just like went to nothing. Like it was like, we now have like SUVs that actually have worse gas mileage than like the first Model T Fords. Like they actually are worse than the first cars ever made. Like it's oil is so cheap still to today. I mean, yeah, I won't get into the questions of like potential carbon costs and externalities and all that stuff. And once you price that in, but like still to today, it's like so cheap that it's still that idea that like a temporary chip shortage will prevent that gadget-filled future. I'm like a little skeptical, even though I would find it more interesting for sure to not have like to throw chips and everything and make it does seem like a boring future.
Maybe the future electric car is going to be kind of a non-digital version. It's interesting that we associate the electric car so much with like Silicon Valley, like at this point, as compared to the traditional industry, and it's not necessary per se.
I'm also wondering like what this means for, when we talk about the digital divide and things like that, what this means for like regions like Africa, where we're talking about leapfrogging technology and access. And so like if silicon ups the cost of the making of everything, what does that mean for like who gets devices and how much they are going to cost and what we prioritize over time? And does it just mean that the folks who already have access to more and the folks who don't?
There are some like intuitively bizarre things about what the cost of, say, a smartphone have been. Like the fact that a smartphone be cheaper than like a meal is pretty wild, And so like maybe, I don't know, is there like some kind of like adjustment happening in this instance too? Like what the costs of some of these conveniences should be. I mean, those of us who are used to paying for like iPhones can't relate, but yeah, some of these things can be very inexpensive, especially relative to other like much more important things.
I mean, not even conveniences though, because there are like entire business ecosystems that have been developed through mobile, like WhatsApp and things like that. So like, what does that start to mean?
Yeah, there are whole dependencies here. I mean, the power grid is entirely based now, is all reliant on silicon, obviously, and computation. And you know, there are applications of computation like, I hate to use the word smarter because it just doesn't gel with me very well, but you know, smarter energy grids, as it were. Solar panels use enormous amounts of silicon in their manufacture. I can't remember the exact statistic. I probably should have got a list of all these statistics, but to pay off the silicon cost of a solar panel takes years and years and years of using the solar panel before it actually makes up for the enormous carbon costs of manufacturing that panel in the first place. So a lot of these things that are very crucial to the survival of the species are dependent on the ongoing silicon. So maybe connecting toothbrushes isn't the best idea at the moment, when you can use wood and bamboo and things like that instead. But I'm sort of, there is an imaginary, I worked on a project over the summer, which had a sort of solar punk course. So are you all familiar with the solar punk idea and the sort of the notion of that? So, and that was interesting because solar punk somewhat envisages a silicon-less future of abundance, right? It doesn't suggest that we in any way enter a dystopia, but you know, if you look at the Brazilian writing that sort of kicked it off, it's a future in which people live abundantly and are healthy and well-fed and they travel and have a good community, but it's just not a reliance on gadgetry in order to achieve that. And the client we were working with had genuine interest in that notion of not adding more gadgets to the world to fix problems, but rolling them back and actually getting to the core of what can make us live in a really abundant and rewarding way without gadgetry. You know? Yeah. I think there is something there maybe, and I think there is some genuine interest in it because at some point it just gets too expensive to keep doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that just material waste from our current way of life is a ridiculous thing that needs to change.
Again, this was also one of the dreams of ubiquitous computing, was that you wouldn't need so much computation.
True.
Because the good folks at Sun Microsystems was the idea that you would just have a computer somewhere over there and you would connect to it occasionally and sort of, you know, in a sort of ambient way rather than in a direct way. As it is, you know, I've got a phone, a computer, another computer, a screen, various other devices in front of me that are all using their own chip.
Indeed, somebody is watching. Todd Simmons chimed in that graphene may be the next material to look at. I don't know much about it. I don't know if you've thought about that.
Well, graphene was huge, right? Like the work done at Manchester University in the 90s to really make advances in graphene and nanotechnology, and then our government cut off all the funding for no reason whatsoever.
Right.
So graphene sheets, yeah, they would be they're highly insulative because they're like basically a sort of highly thin, very layered, almost like diamond-like structure in terms of their density. So there was this idea that they're highly insulative, so they could be used for that. Yeah, graphene's a good point.
Valdez, what do you think? Signal and noise?
Yeah, in its uncertainty, I think, of course, like a signal. I think it is like it could. That reference I brought to like the oil in the 70s, just because that's what happened then doesn't mean that's what's going to happen this time. So the kind of ways it could go, it's definitely been a very generative conversation. I'm like very curious about like the OPEC of like GPUs, like what that might look like, the geopolitics of it, the question of like, I think Radha was bringing up of like unequal access to supply sources and things like that. And the way the world is like organized around controlling access to like key inputs, like for sure, it's like the site of a kind of struggle that I think people didn't until the last 5 years didn't realize was going to take place in the next decade.
Radha, signal or noise?
I say signal, just in the many ways that we were speculating this thing might go forward, and just by the scale of implications that it has. Signal.
Erica?
I'm going to say signal on the chips and maybe noise on the silicon. It's a very particular story around circuitry and I think energy use, or how we even construct an idea of around like GPUs are a very specific narrative around like energy and devices. So just like given maybe cost and the necessity of them and that narrative, the cost and the necessity of them, I would like to see chip development, I guess, become more accessible and more desired by like the everyday person. But yeah, I think that probably would make for the better cyclical processes, and also the opening the right to repair, like that push to maybe open the right to repair in places would be interesting.
Yeah. And that future that like may not have like implications like at the industry scale level, but at like a cultural level is really cool. Like what the future of sort of craft computing can look like. And there's definitely signals that indicate people are becoming more interested in that kind of thing. I think it's a signal just especially in that it prompts us to question priorities and ask really interesting questions about how we determine technological projects. And often everyone's attitude tends to be like, this is the way things are going, and sort of step back and sort of ask that question about, okay, do we need to as aggressively pursue the metaverse as it appears we're going to be is great. Like anything that can get people thinking about that is a good thing. So it's a signal in that way for me. Erica, what is your weakest signal?
My signal is images superimposing the moon. So the idea is that potentially there's some phones that are changing the pictures that we take of the moon. And so from what I understand, it's that this is called superimposing, and this is done in photography. It's a technique that's like pretty obvious to anyone who's like using Photoshop or other editing software. But apparently there's this rumor that Huawei, they have this like periscope camera. Huawei P30 Pro has periscope camera, and it has a moon mode. And that this moon mode is using AI to superimpose images of the moon on the pictures that you actually end up taking of the moon. So it's this idea that you like take a picture of the moon and that the picture is actually far too crisp or clear for it to be an actual picture of the moon. It's a rumor, and Huawei has basically denied it. But yeah, there's just this idea that like if people are taking pictures of the moon and the same side of the moon is always going to be facing you, that why not have a stored image of the moon in phones? And what would be stopping people from like it being automated?
Hit moon mode and it may create a moon that's not actually there or something like that?
Yeah, that there is a moon mode on these periscope cameras, and that, yeah, it just is supposed to like make it clear in certain ways, so that there's this rumor that there's actually just an image of the moon being superimposed.
That it's not actually, okay, got you. It's not even taking a picture of it at all. It's just putting another moon.
It's like a cut and paste function. Is that the idea?
It's like a blend function or something.
And how important that distinction is, I wonder. That's like kind of interesting to kind of how blurred that distinction could be between just like correcting the image of the moon versus adding a new image of the moon.
Exactly. Yeah.
But can you not try it out with like a basketball or something in the background, or like, and see like if it turns that into the moon?
I guess that's kind of the claim, is that like is recognition of the recognition technology that's being used like so good that it wouldn't actually end up imposing on that image because it knows it's not a moon.
What do you think is the signal in this?
It's weird to me that there's a moment being captured in time that hasn't really happened if a moon is being superimposed on an image of the moon. So I find it really weird. And that's kind of what was stated in this tech spec piece. It was that like, how okay are we with AI kind of completing or enhancing our images? Because it is done every day, like something that's like so obvious with smartphones, whether it's like the sky is made bluer or your face is made less blurrier in a photo or something. Or I heard as well that like FaceTime has a feature where it will move your pupils without asking. I guess the whole claim in the piece was, how do we feel about photos being automated with computational photography, basically? And
it's a conversation from the whole history of photography too.
Yeah.
What photography is, I think. I had a Huawei camera at one point, and it had that beauty mode was on Huawei and a lot of other Chinese phones like a long time before the sort of culture of like face filters was as far along as it is now, and before like Snap and Instagram and so on were developing so many of these sort of functions.
Or what people say it might be doing is it's actually superimposing textures, which I think is kind of cool, because it's like this, it's not just like the way AI models are trained to enhance features or whatever. It's actually literally pulling like a file from somewhere and layering it and
compositing.
Yeah. So yeah, it's this like everyday compositional act, which I think is very cool and strange. And the other kinds of tech, like wood, rocks, sky, grass, like there's so many places where there are sort of similar textures that could be popping up in images, which would be cool to think about.
It sort of makes sense because the dynamic range of smartphone cameras are trash, right? They're very good at things that are close and fill up the screen, like faces and stuff like that. But we've had an amazing moon in the UK the last few nights. It's like been noted that it's larger than normal, and I just can't get a picture of it on a smartphone. It just looks like a white yellow smudge. So it sort of makes sense that they'd say, we'll just put something over that. The obvious test seems to be just go somewhere dark with a street light and hold it up in moon mode and see if it puts the texture over it, see if it's working.
It's funny that there's something, that people are at all, I don't know if they're outraged or whatever, but feel some kind of way about this. Given the name of the camera being called the Periscope, which like I think of as like this like spy technology where, to use mirrors or whatever and see what you otherwise can't. But it's by definition, like a periscope is a kind of a type of seeing device or camera that allows you to see things that you can't see. And so that's what it's doing, right? And so maybe that sort of the fictional elements of the photograph that it's producing is actually acknowledged in the name of the tag there.
Yeah, I really do think it's strange when I think about just like capturing a moment, but it didn't really happen. Like, what other things, like, and you've mentioned it a little bit, yeah, what other things are like, how does that like affect the way we look back at images and stuff? Because they're just so edited.
Isn't that our entire lives right now though? Like all of social media? I mean, face filters. I don't know what half my internet friends look like in real life, honestly, at this point.
It's true.
Right? Even Zoom has a feature that makes it look like I don't have dark circles under my eyes right now. Right?
Yeah,
like
Zoom skin smooth.
Right. It smooths your skin out, makes you look radiant. And like, so I don't know if it's the textures thing is really interesting to me. The compositing aspect is really interesting to me. And the fact that it's available to you in a mobile device is super interesting. But this notion that that we're augmenting reality in some manner is no different than exactly what we operate in every day.
I'm just curious what the threshold is, I guess, or like, when does it become not okay? Or
I saw something similar, which I did find genuinely really shocking. And I haven't used this, but the Google Pixel 5 apparently has the ability to remove people from the background. So if you're taking like a picture of yourselves out on a night out or whatever, you can swipe away people in the background. Have you seen the advert for it? I don't know how.
This ad, yeah. Swipe out the photo bombers or whatever.
Yeah, and that feels like a Stalinistic approach, right? Because that's sort of quite extreme to just wipe people from existence,
right?
And remove the imperfection of them, or remove the perceived imperfection you have from your memory of people being not.
I was going to say Google's laying the groundwork for the revolution, so all is good.
Oh, all is well then. They do no evil.
I don't know how into segues you are. I'm still recovering from being an academic. So one of the things I do is throw in like random segues and stuff. But there's an amazing documentary by a guy called Peter Gallison, he wrote this incredible book called Objectivity about the attempt of scientific rationality to approach objectivity through all sorts of measuring devices, including the camera. And he did this amazing documentary called Black Hole, The Edge of All We Know. And it's basically about this sort of 14-year mission to take a photograph of a black hole and the incredible sort of decision-making process that the scientists working on it had to go through for how they would like bias the vision of the black hole, especially because at the same time they were doing this, the film Interstellar came out, which was really famous for having one of the most scientifically accurate visualizations of a black hole, which was done in collaboration with physicists. And it was really interesting how, it's like the image itself is like 20 pixels by 20 pixels. It's 80 odd million light years away, but they go through all these decisions. What colors do we use? How do we choose to frame it? Where do we cut? Where's the edge of the black hole versus the middle of the black hole? So speaking about the visualization of cosmic phenomena, that's a really interesting side for anybody who's interested in that stuff.
Yeah, totally. And this is another like sort of question about like why this project and not that one, and why no energy goes into like a beautiful visualization of like a nuclei or something, or like a proton. I don't like, there's other things we can't see that we could use technology to visualize, and why maybe the aesthetics of a black hole or something that's far away seem to matter more than those that are microscopic.
I just wanted to jump back to that black hole image, because I know that like Benjamin Bratton, this like design theorist, talks about that image as well. And when he juxtaposes it against like the event horizon image of like the 1960s and 70s, which was the image of the Earth reflected back from the moon. And so he kind of uses that as like an example of almost like myopic, not myopic necessarily, but like self-reflective thinking. Like the image that defined the 60s and 70s is just like us looking back at ourselves. Whereas the black hole image was made by actually turning the entire Earth into an aperture, essentially. And so by coordinating telescopes across the entire planet, you made an aperture that was the size of the planet itself in order to see something that literally you can't see, because a black hole is obviously like no light escapes from it. And so it's this very strange kind of moment where we actually used all of the potential of computing technology and synthesis to do something very strange in a way that like using it to just like make better textures of like the moon for images you share on social media platforms is like not a very interesting use of something that has a very different kind of potential behind it. Like these synthetic images could be really useful, you know, like synthetic knowledge is like very, very useful. Like we need to synthesize to think through stuff.
How much of this signal is about the fact that we're talking about the moon right now? Is there some like fundamentally human thing like that this even comes up, and that there's any controversy specifically about images of the moon, and that this is like the thing that matters about like truth technology and like what that says about humans and like sort of the entirety of human like history, mythology, and like symbolism? And with regard to the moon, if it says anything about this time, or it's just like a thing, always the moon matters. It has to do with like rhythms of time, femininity, like cycles, eternity, like light, enlightenment, and so on.
Maybe it's evolution from, this is a reach, but it reminds me of the Whole Earth catalog with like Stuart Brand. I guess he was demanding actual images of Earth, but at one point, are we going to end up demanding real images of the moon or something like that, you know, where Whole Earth was kind of demanding NASA to show the images of the actual Earth because it just wasn't available at the time, with all these like superimposed images of the moon. Like, will we get to a point where we just start demanding real pictures of the moon?
Yeah, interesting. That idea is relatively new. The like pale blue dot, the whole Earth image, the being able to see like the curve of the Earth is relatively new, but the both function and relationship to the moon is much, that view from humans is much older, as old as humans. And whether that is like, whether there's some like import to that, you know, and when this comes up and why.
So one of my lines of research that you maybe nodded to at the beginning, Rob, was I do a lot of stuff around computational image production, which is also where my interest in GPUs come from, and the increasing standardization of the tools of image production. So whether it's rendering or machine learning, whatever it is, results in an aesthetic hegemony, right? It results in, so someone at Huawei has made a decision about what the best picture of the moon is and then put it into everybody's photos.
Yeah.
It's allegedly.
Sorry.
Of all the things Huawei's been accused of, this is by far the most egregious. Yeah.
One of the things that happens in the development of all these software, and I've spoken about it at length in architecture, so sort of CAD software, for instance, you know, is someone makes a perfectly innocent decision saying, look, this is the best default steel material we have. This is the best default concrete. This is the best default moon. Right. And they're trying to make the software or whatever it is more usable. That's right. And it's all from good places. But in doing so, you standardize that particular material. So going back to your point, Erica, will we demand a real moon? Is like that, does that become the default moon in the same way that the Willem screen becomes the default screen? You know, the other moons start to look strange by comparison, which strangely ties into how Galison talks about standardization and objectivity. You develop an objective standard, a so-called standard, against which everything else seems somehow flawed, despite the fact it's more real in some way.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've talked about default pizzas, which somehow reminds me of default modes on this with the conversation about pizza games on here before. That's interesting. The fact that there's a moon mode. So there's some of these things that are being selected as like, we need to have a default of this, right? Is the interesting choice. Signal or noise, Radha?
When it comes to just like this notion of augmenting things in our world already to make them like the perfect image of what we think, that to me is already a thing and already exists. So I'm going to say noise.
Okay. Tobias?
This feels like a really harsh game show. I'm not sure.
It doesn't matter if it's a signal
not
or
personal,
noise.
I promise.
For some reason, we feel good or bad if it's a signal.
I think insofar as it indicates increasing authorial decision-making of software manufacturers on creative pursuits, which has been something that's been going on since the invention of Photoshop, I think it is a signal of that.
Okay.
But I think it's, as Radha said, is one of many things, from skin smoothing on Zoom through to, you know, making eyes bigger, that I think Huawei's been doing for ages anyway. Like, it's part of that procession of seemingly small, sort of just insignificant changes that actually add up to basically one day you'll open up your camera and there'll be nothing original in it. It'll all be just manufactured piecemeal stuff put in. I'm not committing to a signal or noise. A noisy signal.
Fine. Valdez?
I think the idea of like compositing like realities is interesting and part of just, I guess, a wider trend in terms of like what synthetic computational imagery enables you to do. But there's lots of different ways it can go. And I guess in that sense, it's kind of noisy in that regard.
I'm going to say signal more in this conversation about like relative to the fact that there's selfie mode, which seems like an obvious thing to be pursuing in like our current sort of age of narcissism, but there's something more like essentially maybe spiritual or cosmic about this idea of like having a moon mode built into a camera that maybe says something about like where our relationship to our devices and what we're pursuing with them is changing. That's a hopeful signal for me. Valdez, what's your weakest signal?
It was this story written by Ted Gioia, who's this music journalist, ex-corporate dude, who spoke about how old songs represent something like 70% of the US market right now. And so new music, being defined as like in the last 18 months, has been like declining consistently as a total share of what people listen to. So more and more, it's just that the music industry is entirely based on acquiring catalogs. So like people aren't even investing in like new artists. They're actually like just going through bidding wars for like Dylan and I don't even know what old bands, like is Jefferson Airplane? That's like a band, right? Yeah, the sheer size of like how much money is just going into these bidding wars to take over like these old catalogs that can just be kind of milked for everything that they're worth. And that process like really accelerated. I think this is like where the signal part to some extent comes in. It really accelerated over COVID. And so it kind of jumped something like 20% in the last 18 months. Like the share of old music was just booming. So I'm kind of curious about it. I was thinking through like the potential ways that like, if you want to radicalize like the idea, like what would it mean to like live in a world where there was no new music whatsoever? I mean, I think that's not a realistic assumption, but just to kind of go through that thought experiment of like what that even means or what would even make that possible, for people to stop doing stuff like that. It gets me to just reflect on like what is the function of music. And obviously there's like the industry questions of why this particular industry is doing the things that it's doing and what is its future. So I kind of just opened up like a range of questions for me. So I thought it was interesting in that regard as a signal.
Did this peak like at the beginning of the pandemic?
I don't know, like month by month, what the story would be.
And I asked that because I'm wondering if like there's something that has happened to us cognitively, having to deal with the amount of like uncertainty and change, whether it like pushes us to some form of nostalgia, even if it's for a time that we didn't necessarily experience personally, but there's kind of like this desire to like remember the better times or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. I agree. I also thought about how like live music has just not been a thing for a while. So I was like, well, it's not that surprising that it jumped in that regard because people just can't even feel like they're part of some movement.
There's a lot of different pieces to this in my mind. So there's always been like sampling and covering and sort of updated versions have happened in the whole history of music. That's always been a thing, to classical music and everything. But I would say in pop music recently, it's definitely been a lot more of that than there was in the 90s. Like Puff Daddy kind of popularized it as like a technique for making hits in the late 90s, early 2000s. But right now it's like a lot of songs that are being remade, songs that have been remade many times coming out. And that I think is a sort of de-risking thing that's happening in terms of like what songs that are proven to make hits, whatever going on. Then there's like TikTok has a lot to do with this, right? So early in the pandemic, there was a very big story about this. Everybody here, I'm sure, saw the guy called Dogface420, who was holding the back of a truck, skateboarding, holding his phone up and drinking a cranberry juice while listening to Fleetwood Mac's. And Fleetwood Mac's streams went through the roof during that. And so that was like that was just like an overall vibe. But I think there's like a remix culture sort of thing in here where you just, someone like that can take an element from something, and as a result, like an already rich band gets richer at a completely unexpected moment in that case, just based off of this like kind of vibe that everybody seems to need in the midst of like global lockdown, pretty much. Oh, and then there's been several huge artists, right, selling their catalogs that they owned, and that may have to do with not being able to make money from touring, right, which I think you alluded to as you were talking about this, where it's just like we can't tour right now. Like, I wonder how long this is going to be. My best earning days may be behind me, and so like this economic factor of like selling the catalog, and then what do you do with that catalog when it comes up? So it seems like there's a bunch of sort of unrelated things contributing here.
I think a lot of it ties into readily available data on listening habits as well. So in 2014, The Atlantic did a really big investigation, and they coined a great phrase called the Shazam Effect, which was basically that there was so much data about people's listening habits based on their user data, their age, their location, everything else, that it was very easy to figure out what people would listen to when and under what circumstances, and then just manufacture music to fit it. And so they coined this idea of the Shazam effect, which is basically you end up with the music industry reproducing the same music over and over again because they know what works. You don't get true sort of musical innovation in the same ways that you maybe did before when it was more about breakthrough bands or whatever it was. And you end up with this sort of flattening. And that was paralleled with a study done by some Spanish academics where they actually did like tonal and frequency analysis of the pop hits from like the last 5 years. And they actually showed that technically they were very, very similar. They would use very similar speeds and tones and progressions and chords and things like that. And so there was a sort of general flattening of the range of available music. Of course, a lot of that is based on what's gone before. So you end up recycling the old stuff. And as you said, once COVID hits and people can't tour or write music, you would end up with people going back to the back catalogue and recycling it. And there's a great thread of writing on Real Life about the manufacturing of nostalgia as well, that they've opened up a whole thread of writing now, talking about the sort of the imperative that a lot of companies that use data as their mainstay of selling advertising have on pushing people back into nostalgia, because it results in predictable behavior patterns, whether that's listening to stuff or creating stuff or reusing memes, whatever it is.
Sitcom reboots are a big thing.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. It creates a predictable stream of users if you can do that and keep them regurgitating the same stuff over and over again.
Does it not end at some point? How long can you do it?
I mean, who knows? There's a great book by Grafton Tanner called Babbling Corpse, where he's in this Real Life mag stream as well, but he wrote this book a few years ago, and he was speculating that vaporwave was the sort of end of culture, because he said that vaporwave is like truly attributionless, authorless, endlessly reusable media.
It has origins in Japanese city pop, though.
Yeah, for sure. But in terms of like the actual creation of it and the way that things are assembled to make, whether it's a video or a piece of music, it's sort of attribution.
Sure.
That's why he calls it a babbling corpse, right? It's just like it has no attribution or connection to any particular thing. It's, he loves it and he lauds it, but he says that's the sort of end of culture in some ways.
I don't know if anyone's familiar with the lo-fi hip-hop raccoon on YouTube, but that's like another weird sort of authorless like thing. And like, I don't know where it really comes from, but there's a little raccoon character, and like people like to work to this like lo-fi ambient hip-hop.
Just like lo-fi ambient pop, millions and millions of streamers all the time.
Yeah, those things are cool. Udit at some point it sent me like this thing that people were doing where it was like, it's like if you go on YouTube and you search like Total Africa playing from a super mall or whatever, and there's like this effects, filters essentially that are being added to like popular songs to create an even more nostalgic effect of like a certain ambient environment, which is kind of interesting. Or listening to a song as though it sounds like you're in the parking lot of like the roller ring, something like that. That appeals to me. There's a TikTok dance, I think from this year, like people are actively making dances around it right now, for a song by an artist called Jibs, that came out in like 2006, called Does Your Chain Hang Low, which is based on what we all probably would know as Do Your Ears Hang Low, which is based on a military song, which was Do Your Balls Hang Low, which is also the ice cream song that we would know from the ice cream truck most of the time, which was a song that was incredibly racist lyrics at one point, which goes back to being a song called Turkey in the Straw. That's like an American folk song as early as like 1820. So I guess like certain things that like work can be weaponized, appropriated, and like if a melody works, it works, and reappropriated and so on.
There's an inverse thing, which is there's a lot of copyright trolls now in music, and Blurred Lines, which like a few years ago got sued for stealing the I forget what it was, like the melody or some part of the song.
It's a Marvin Gaye song. Yeah, the groove.
So now there's all these lawyers out there who are like sitting on waiting for the big hit to come along just to sue it so that they can get like some percent of that. And apparently it's resulted in like even executives who refuse to listen to demo tapes because there's the risk that if they hear some melody and it gets used in something else that they do, that they'll be sued for having listened and taken it. So just a kind of random.
I've looked into this kind of copyright law stuff before too, and it's like it would be very easy to defend against if I were to be that copyright troll, because you can argue if you can reasonably justify that you would have never heard the song.
I guess with TikTok or Musical.ly, their whole like platform is built off of like, this reproduction of sound. So they like really promote to keep adding on to other people's sound. So then you get things that are manufactured, or the music artists, or the things that are manufactured for specifically TikTok. And I'm wondering if anything new comes out of that, because you asked in the beginning, Valdez, what would music be like if nothing was new? Was that what you said or something? Yeah. So I'm wondering if like TikTok...
Is it already like that?
Is it already like that? Or is TikTok kind of like this grounds for manufacturing something that's like is completely divergent of like what is in the zeitgeist of TikTok? Or I don't know. TikTok is specifically a platform that's like, you have all these samples, people are constantly building off it. There's not necessarily a catalog or anything being built. So can you ever really have a bidding war within like an ecosystem like that? What comes up then when people do get a little more nitpicky about original pieces or something?
To jump back all this to the blurred lines thing, which is like kind of a irony. There's some irony in that name with that particular instance. Like that one was very controversial because it wasn't the melody, wasn't the words. It was like what's called like the groove, like a lot of other terms, and it's kind of a wastebasket term. It's like, it's a combination of elements, right? And you could listen and you could definitely hear it. So on the one hand, there's like some sort of judgment, like, you know, when you hear it, maybe that this has been ripped off and that like that they're laying off of that song. But on the other hand, it's like, it potentially limits creativity a lot. And there's like a question about what is a convention of a genre, for example, or just a convention of music versus what's supposed to be original. There's a lot of genres of music where everything is going to sound quite similar. There's interesting like origin things like that come up too. Erica and I had a conversation about like the music genres and how things like folk or pop were really at one point describing something about like how something exists. Like pop was about being popular. Folk meant like that it was just like something that was of the people, that was authorless. Over time, each of those pop became a sound associated with certain acts, and Britney Spears and so on, as did folk become a sound, not sort of a practice. So these things were like kind of saying completely different things about genres. But yeah, once that happens, it's like, are you able to sue someone because they're working within a genre? You know, can you enforce copyright infringement laws?
I guess
things like that.
There's some super specifics around copyright infringement, which are interesting. To go back to what Erica was saying, I'd be interested to know what conversations happen around the recording of music when, you know, if you went back 30, 40 years, the aim of the production suite was to make a song sound good on a car tape deck, right? That was like, I remember a friend of mine telling me that was like the baseline. If it sounded good on a shitty car tape deck, it would sound good anywhere. So you produce it for that. Are they those conversations now? It needs to sound good on TikTok out of a phone speaker being held at the back of a bus between a load of 15-year-olds, right? And that's now like the sort of the end point. The other thing is there's a at least on YouTube, there's like a technical limit on how much of a piece of copyrighted material you can use. So you can use, I think, like up to 5 or 6 seconds of like a copyright song or film clip before it becomes an infringement. And is it the same on TikTok? In which case, that's why we end up with these sort of looping, endlessly sampled sounds. I don't have TikTok, so I'm somewhat familiar with the culture there, but I haven't been there myself. So is the sounds being used, is the production of that music an artifact of the technical and legal constraints of TikTok, which means we end up with certain songs that are then heard by billions of people that end up becoming rejuvenated hits as a result?
People start releasing 5-second songs.
But that's happening. That's a trend that's happening. Not 5-second songs, but for a number of reasons, songs have gotten way shorter. Like the idea that the 3-minute song was that was what they used to say, or 4 minutes in like the 80s, 90s, early, and it became 3 minutes, and then
the Bohemian Rhapsody came along and challenged that.
Yeah. There's exceptions. But
Rob, you may remember this. There was like a band that released an album that was 10 1-second songs of silence, and they released it on Spotify because they got paid per play, right?
Yeah.
So they knew how to like hack the technical and legal framework in which they're operating in order to it. And they technically made an album of 10 1-second songs that were totally silent, get paid, and just asked their fans to play it in the background while they were doing other things. So do you end up with a genre of music, as we have done historically, like rock and roll is also a product of its technical constraints, where you end up with a genre of music that isn't pop or folk, but is a product of social networks, like in the same way that vaporwave actually is a product of, as Graph and Tanicles, it's sort of like the Tumblr generation and that sort of attributionless content sharing.
The shortness of songs, part of it is like running up streaming numbers in general. That's like a thing people know. If you have the first 10 songs on your album or whatever are 2 minutes, like you're running up your streams faster, and that's good for charting and getting paid and so on. And that's something that can be corrected or whatever. But I think your other point, I'm fascinated by that, and like just the constraints of like things like a record and you know what the sort of rock art albums of the Doors and the Beach Boys and so on, actually designing this like whole project to fit that, the A side and the B side of the tape, how that changed the album by having that and singles and things like that, and I think actually how long it took people to adjust. I think there's to some extent it was recognized that like actually the album is a good format, period, regardless of what you can do. It's like a nice amount of time and like a good format to put a collection of songs together, because that technical constraint is gone. And it could be, I think there are more singles and EPs though now, but you could also have like an album with 100 songs or whatever. And then TikTok, I think, is changing things. It reminds me of like early hip hop, where they're taking like the breakbeat as like the best part of the song where everybody wants to dance and just like looping that. Now you have this acknowledgement of like, what's the TikTok part? And that's becoming a thing when people are making a song, like being aware, what's the TikTok part of the song that you're going to use as like that snippet that people are going to either dance to or build content around or whatever. So kind of changing how you're thinking strategically about composition.
I think it's actually a good seg into like when I brought up the signal and I was like, oh, what would it mean to have a world without music? It was like, well, to ask that question, you have to think, what does music do? And so it's not just like shaped by, yes, the technical affordances of the recording and playing equipment. It's not just like the economic questions of like algorithms pushing certain forms of content. It's also like culturally, what is it like reflecting and doing in the way that like stuff like the rise of like rock in the 50s, like you're going through a world that's like literally 10 years before is engaged in like the most giant like mechanized warfare like to ever have like been conceived in the world. Also a world where like horses were just like rampant, you know, like through the 50s in Europe, horses are still present everywhere on the street. And so huge changes are taking place. Hip hop, it's like similar, but it's more like it's the deindustrialization, right, of the process in the 80s and 90s. And it's like the hollowing out of whatever dream was promised through the rise of industrialism. Whereas now it's kind of like, what is it reflecting? Like we live in some kind of sort of servicey post, like what economy exactly? Like what is music supposed to reflect and attune us to and like get us like used to and feeling and vibing with, you know? It's like this strange hold pattern, you know, like what is it?
I haven't looked at this before, but I get ambient music of various sorts, like since it being coined, which I think it sort of like has its origins with Brian Eno and his like ambient tapes, seems to be like way more popular right now than it ever had been before in terms of people actually listening. It doesn't occupy a space in pop culture necessarily, but I think it's listened to a lot. And if you start to lump in lo-fi hip hop and vaporwave and things like that under what we call ambient music, then that seems pretty clear. And it does kind of say something. I mean, it's a pretty stark contrast to the like loudness of like subcultures like punk emerging and hip hop actually like mimicking like the sonics of its surrounding environment and like the burning Bronx in the late 70s. Yeah.
You get the music you deserve.
Yeah, I guess that's right. Yeah.
Martyrcore. Yeah. I think what maybe stands out today is like the role of curation, and that isn't necessarily just like spotlight a DJ because DJs have been around for so long, but just that curation of music in different aspects of our life, like whether it's just like sampling through TikTok or actually setting out like a musical set and playing it for an audience. I feel like the role of curation plays a bigger role, maybe a more commercial role, and a more accessible role in and how we even work with our devices. But yeah, I just think there's something about just how curation is viewed today and how that makes music more accessible. Like I often go to the example of a scratch record or something, how like the record player kind of made music more accessible to communities who didn't have access to instruments at one point, to be able to like remix and layer records on top of each other. So I'm just wondering what that moment of, I guess, accessibility to music today is too. And that's probably just the everyday use of TikTok right now is probably the most like burgeoning thing I can think of.
Yeah, it's one. I mean, I think like over the past like 30, 40 years, like whatever it's been, like rap is a thing that like it's sort of anyone can do without any instrument, without any singing skills, without any lessons necessarily, without any. And so there's like an access and participation through things like that. Probably like doo-wop was at one point too, but doo-wop I think required more singing.
In the early 10s, it would have been the availability of bedroom production software that suddenly rocketed out of nowhere. So Apple shipping Rock Band was it called Rock Band? What was their production software? GarageBand, or as we say in UK, GarageBand.
GarageBand.
It was putting GarageBand on every laptop just made it suddenly everyone could make and record music, in their room, and that resulted. I was in bands at that point in my young life, and that resulted in everyone just suddenly having albums out in HMV and whatnot. Like out of nowhere, people were going from I've recorded a song, I put it on MySpace, and now I've got a record deal and I'm touring. That was huge, and that was similar, I guess, to how like early rock and roll would have been. If you think about like Elvis and stuff, where you go to the record shop with your $5 and you pay to rent it for the evening, you record your record, and then you can make it. That was like, and in those days, all those records were covers, right? They were all covering the same sort of blues songs over and over again. And there's a whole problematic culture there of all these white rock stars that covered all the blues music that was being recorded by African-American artists. But that was probably the same boom. There was this enormous freedom, similar to maybe like the 808 in hip hop, right? And that ability to suddenly make music quite compactly without the need of a whole studio or a whole crew or even technical expertise, really. And I can go back to my comment about software defaults. There's a reason why a lot of that music sounds very similar, is they were all using the same presets for piano, strings, drums that came and shipped with Apple's GarageBand, and there was a whole sound there.
It's funny, unlike like GPU chips, I have no concerns over there being a shortage of music. Like it's sort of, one fundamentally joyful thing, either when it's just, I guess that doesn't need to be new though. Joy can happen without any sort of originality per se, I guess, or with very little. But I don't know. Yeah, there is something innate, I think, in the urge to create new music and play with new sounds. I always love the Derrida quote, like the song presents life to itself, which I think we kind of have circled around in this conversation. And it reminds me too, even that even in each instance of that Turkey in the Straw song, you're like, in good and sort of horrific ways, it's presenting life to itself, down to like the more recent one, Jibs, being like, was totally a product of the moment of ringtone music in 2006. So like, in each instance, it's like this repeated thing. But the desire seems like it's always going to be there, and so many people make it. I just feel like there's so much good music, original music, like well done music in the world right now, probably more than ever before.
Rob, we don't need to speculate about a world without new music. It's just enjoy. It's called the metaverse. That's where it ends. That's where
I wonder.
Joy and desire in life.
That's an interesting thing, because that's like one of the new things that's become like a problem, and solutions are emerging, is remote collaboration in music in real time. And there's starting to be stuff, but it's still a bit of a challenge for people. And obviously that was something that came up over the course of the pandemic. But when you say metaverse, it's like, cool space. What role does that play? And like how does that change what the software can look like? Stuff, bringing in eye contact, bringing in all these other sort of things. Yeah.
With your fake pupils.
And just the weird what's happening in the background through, like, to deal with the issues of like micro timing, like to correct for that kind of thing. What is the artificial intelligence doing to make it so that you're hearing and responding to things, and that's sort of balanced accurately? Because if you try it over Zoom, my experience is that it's just like a mess. You're not able to communicate where you're actually meaning for each note to hit. Do I need to ask on this one? It's clearly noise, right? Erica, what do you think?
That's pretty meta for
the only kind of music I listen to
is noise music. Yeah.
I just should. None of that lo-fi ambient shit. Maybe that's nice. Yeah, Erica, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm gonna say noise because I think that like basically, yeah, I just think mashups are what make different genres. But perhaps on the side of the catalogs, I think it would be really interesting if TikTok released like a catalog of, or like the stream of like all the different links in songs, or tried to find all the different links in songs or something. I think that would be amazing and and then I don't even know what would come of that, but I don't think there's access to a repository of sampling like that. So that I think is a signal too.
I like that. What DJ is creating the annual TikTok Megamix? I'm sure someone's got this going.
Yes.
Radha, what is this a signal? Or?
I think it's a noisy signal. And I say that because I think, well, TikTok's been around for like a few years. I don't know if we know everything about how it's going to impact like music culture over time. So to me, that's something that's still worth watching.
Tobias?
Yeah, I'm in agree with the noisy signal. There's lots of dimensions to this, which are really interesting, not least Bruce Sterling's adage that whatever happens to musicians happens to everyone eventually, right? So, music tends to be at the receiving end of any change before anything else, because everybody listens to music. So it's impacted really quickly. It's interesting to parallel with like Netflix, right? So Netflix's initial offering was a profit on the long tail of movies that no one else was showing, which then when everyone realized the money to be made there quickly resulted in everyone buying back their IP and streaming it themselves on their own streaming services. So that idea of like, to go back to the original signal, which was all these old catalogs now becoming really well played, is like, do they get reclaimed at some point by the original owners to become really profitable? And I would disagree with Rob, your suggestion that there'll always be new music, because I shared an article that sort of scientifically proves that there is less and less new music, and
maybe on the charts. I
think maybe as someone in the cultural zeitgeist who is a musician, you're more aware of it. But for most people, that is not their experience. That music is becoming flatter.
Yeah, that's fair.
As people are serendipitously coming across new bands or whatever it is. So it's a noisy signal in the sense that it does indicate a future of music that achieves this computational reduction that a lot of the music companies, I think, aspire to. The perfect pop tune that is endlessly replayable by everyone forever in a metaverse, or not.
Last thing, trivia, I learned that apparently at one point David Bowie, did you know about this? He had an IPO of his catalog at some point in his career. And anyway, it was something I just learned about, but as an interesting model. This was basically done in like, the option would be like get a publishing deal, I guess would be what people would do typically, but instead he like got the cash that he would get out of a publishing deal through fans buying into his company. Anyway, broadcast from later.